The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Sufi Thought and Action by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Today's Sufis comment on the scholars. Mohandis el-Alawit. The main avenues of information from which people obtain their impressions about the Sufis, apart from those few outside the fold who happen to be acquainted with real Sufis, a tiny minority, come from the written word. The dictionaries and encyclopedias are in general too confused or too limited in content to offer much useful material. Next come articles in the popular and specialist, religious, philosophical and academic press, which almost always labour a single point of view and cannot be said to provide an adequate background. Two main kinds of books in general circulation constitute the third source of material. Of these, the first are popular works which confuse Sufism with cults, with occultism, or with various systems of thought such as yoga or Zen. This class of material has greatly multiplied recently because of the growing interest in experiential religion and psychology. These works are of very uneven quality. Again, they are seldom deeply researched, and for the most part their authors rely upon the rehashing technique or upon information supplied by adventurous cults. The second category of printed books are those of the self-styled specialists, often Orientalists, whose work is, because of the university or other appointments of the writers, regarded as authoritative. The opinions and reactions of genuine Sufis to this material seem never to have been tested, and the present writer therefore submitted questions to a number of them, from Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East, to ascertain their position. It is no secret that Sufis and professional or professed scholars have been at odds ever since records on the subject are available, which means for over 1,000 years. Sufis executed in the past through scholars' testimony include the redoubtable Hallaj, the great Sufi martyr. The major teacher Ibn al-Arabi, known in the East as the greatest master Sheikh al-Kabir, was hauled before an inquisition and had to satisfy scholars that his interpreter of desires was mystical and not love poetry. He satisfied them, unusually, thereby showing what most commentators feel to be nothing more than that he was their master in debate and interpretation, rather than that they were especially susceptible to justice. The attitudes of the medieval scholastics, however, persisted in the minds of even such a recent Orientalist as the highly acclaimed Ignaz Goldziher, who, in the face of almost unanimous testimony to Arabi's importance, could call him a swindler, which he felt able to do without the need to adduce any evidence as to his swindles. The Sufis of today, rightly one might imagine, given the background just abbreviated, regard scholars with a fair amount of suspicion. There are two main reasons for the Sufi reservations about the academics. One, scholars undoubtedly distort, misunderstand, and misreport, and the Sufis have adduced numerous examples of this tendency which effectively combats scholarly claims to objectivity in the handling of materials, for instance. And two, scholars, through their assumption of authority, tend to make people who read them think that their materials and conclusions must be authoritative and correct. The main remarks by contemporary Sufis, which are borne out by an examination of works in print about Sufis by scholars and specialists, are these. Many of the assertions made are contradictory, as when an authority will say that Sufism is derived from Christianity, but on another page that it is self-generated. Again, another well-known writer says both that Sufism is limited only to Muslims and also that all Christians are Sufis. A surprisingly large number of present-day students of Sufism confuse it with a sort of occultism and resort to amazing phrases and ideas which can find no support in the classical materials. Islamic scholars in the West make the most childish mistakes in references to the materials and contexts of the Sufis, which betray a great ignorance of Islam and of the setting of early Sufis. A low level of knowledge of Persian and Arabic, the main languages used in the Sufi classics, is evidenced by several scholars in the West. These include eminent professors Arbery and Nicholson. Some of them translate materials while at the same time admitting that they do not understand what the Eastern people make of them. An example is Gertrude Bell in her translations from Hafiz. Many writers imagine, with Berger for instance, that a study of a deteriorated cult using Sufi externals, such as the highly fossilized form of Bektashism still lingering in areas of the former Turkish Empire, are in fact Sufi entities. Such writers as John Subhan imagine that superseded formulations and practices, used in olden times for specific purposes, are integral to Sufism. Most of the Orientalists fail to study the contemporary living aspects and organizations of the Sufis, or else fail to amalgamate into their studies such first-hand and often first-class materials collected by others, as for instance Burke, among the dervishes, Lefort, the teachers of Gurdjieff, and Fatemi in Sufi Studies East and West. There is now a considerable bibliography of materials of this kind, almost unnoticed by the specialists. Many Orientalists, some of whom are actually converts to one or other minority religious group in Islam, try to present Sufism as some sort of aspect of the area which the writers themselves favor. This is especially marked in certain Western Shia scholars, who try to establish the Shia roots of Sufis. This tribalistic approach makes much of their work, perhaps fortunately, almost unreadable and certainly of little or no value except as curiosities of belief. A surprising number of modern Orientalist students regularly mistake the imitative cults who are running supposedly Sufi groups and movements as the genuine article. Although the genuine Sufis can easily make out an unanswerable case for the relative incompetence of scholars in the Sufis' own field, this does not, of course, establish the authority of the Sufis as Sufis. It only shows that the Sufis, in general, are far better scholars than the scholars themselves. Peculiarities and Use of the Sufi Meeting Place by Ferruccio Amadeo. Most of the names of the Sufi meeting place are traditionally taken from Persian and Arabic. The most familiar ones are Hujra, room, Zavia, corner, Tekia, a support, a place of repose, Daira, a circle, Dar al-Baraka, abode of blessing. The most ancient and legitimate usage of the meeting place is that it shall be reserved for specific occasions. This is said to be because the configuration of the room or other place is designed to attract and to concentrate a certain subtle force, baraka, which is collected and disseminated among those who attend meetings. If, so the argument goes, too many people use the premises too often, not only will this baraka be dissipated, but the impress of the negative characteristics of the people present will disturb the atmosphere and may even result in cultish or other extravagant behavior. This stricture, however, is not found to be obeyed in most of the communities which style themselves Sufi, and hence might well be used as a measure of deciding whether they are not, after all, no matter their prestige, really only automatic or fossil remnants. Special meetings to concentrate energies may also be held, but the use of the meeting place, which therefore tends to resemble an instrument rather than anything else, depends upon the presence of a teacher who knows how the personnel and the activities will concentrate the necessary energy. The relationship between the characters of the people present is extremely important, according to the traditional law. No meeting place of this kind can be formed or used unless there is a community of at least 400 people. This is said to be because this makes possible the selection of 30 at most, who can both take part in the proceedings and also supply the range of types which are needed to absorb and to generate the needed subtle force. As might be expected with such an instrument, the size, shape, and siting of the place, together with the materials employed, are thought to be most important. The dimensions, siting, interior decor, and appurtenances are all subject to the most careful arrangement and calculation. As an instance, brass and wood join ceramics and wool or sheepskins, as important in the collecting and reflecting of the baraka. How they are placed and when and where, and even by whom, is given the most careful consideration. The attitude of the people entering the room must be taken into account, since it affects the proceedings which are held there. Each individual, however, may be of more than one type, since the Sufis hold that all people are composed of numerous distinct, more or less developed personalities, and that the grouping of such people will maximize or minimize their tendencies, to the advantage or detriment of the progress of the individuals and the group in the search for higher consciousness mediated by the teacher. Most of these considerations, it will be observed, have fallen into disuse in the Sufi groups which are generally accessible to most researchers. Photographs of alleged Sufi meeting places, too, indicate that they tend to become cluttered with appurtenances of merely traditional value or sentimental significance, something which a major part of the traditional Sufi activity is devoted to avoiding wherever found. When the meeting place is called a samakhana, hall of listening, it is often used in deteriorated groups for all kinds of purposes, such as meetings, dance, and other exercises, and for the participation in the dance or other movements which is a sign of the deterioration of the teaching, according to the best authorities. Traditionally, the building or organizing of the meeting place is of the greatest importance. Ancient accounts of the setting up of such places seem to agree on certain principles and practices. First, the teacher will collect a number of followers. Then he will provide a small or introductory meeting place. While preparations are being made for the great or ultimate meeting place, the existing one will be used less and less. This is said to be because it is set aside for the accumulation of the baraka which will be stored and transferred to the ultimate meeting place when this is ready. The collection of funds for the great meeting place is approached with considerable care and attention. First, no actual collection of funds is made because it is considered a manifestation of the working of the baraka when people donate sums of money spontaneously for the purpose. It is believed that, without prompting, the fund of the meeting place starts to grow and snowball as the need for the place and the impression of the accumulation of the baraka seeps directly, subliminally, into the minds of the disciples. As soon as this happens, they start to accumulate funds. Sometimes, as with other devotional traditions, they part with much of their property, and the resultant sums are given, always anonymously and in secret, in cash, to the teacher. The increased cost of property throughout the world, more particularly in the West, might be thought to have slowed down this process. But when it is realized that some meeting places of the Sufis of the past were built and organized, or converted from existing buildings, at a cost equal to half the total possessions of the disciples, an equivalent amount today with the relative affluence of Western societies, would be colossal and well ahead of the present-day cost of buildings. As with other spiritual communities, the amount of material sacrifice which the members are prepared to make is regarded as an indicator of their generosity, something which in turn affects favorably their ability to profit from the teaching. While such an idea might not recommend itself to those who have reservations about the Sufi or any other system's validity, it cannot be denied that the great masters of the path have always adhered to this policy, even if they were kings or others who were not themselves in need of any part of the material substance handed in for the meeting place. Interestingly enough, it is said among the Sufis that the building of the Egyptian pyramids was originated in the same fashion. That is, a certain number of initiates donated the colossal sums needed to produce the powerhouses, which was the function of the pyramids of old. These, incidentally, are now held to have discharged their functions and to be incapable of functioning as attractors and stores of barakah. The octagonal shape is thought to be the most important for such a building, and brass or copper will attract the barakah, though only if the specialized knowledge which is held by the teachers is brought to bear on the project. Light, sound, and something else not specified work within the building to provide the substance which is supposed to perform the Sufi miracle of enlightenment. Sufi authorities point to the undeniable fact that people all over the world have built colossal and amazing buildings as a part of their religious activities. And they add that originally these were intended to work as some sort of scientific instrument, principally working with the barakah factor. Information on this point is hard to obtain, understandably, but there is evidence that these concentrators are still being built and adapted from other suitable buildings. Avoiding Imitators by Ghashim Mirzoeff. During the Middle Ages, the writings of such Sufi greats as Al-Ghazali and Ibn al-Arabi profoundly influenced the religious and scientific thought of the West. It is not too far to go to say that Western philosophical and religious thinking, as well as much of European literature, would certainly not be what it is, in content or quality, without the Sufi influence, which has been documented by an increasing number and variety of workers in the West itself. There seems little doubt that there has been a continuing interchange between the Sufis and the West. Certainly, much recent research indicates this. This intercommunication, however, appears to have become naturalized very early on. The strange men in odd headgear who chant and gyrate, mentioned with approval by Ramon Lull 7 centuries ago, are more likely today to be men and women who are as at home in the West as in the East. They are likely to be people who have adapted the traditional, culture-linked ideas and practices of the East to the milieu of the West, which today, of course, includes the Americas and places as far afield as Australia and South Africa. But there is another layer of supposedly Sufi activity which has invaded the West, and which is clearly based either on the excitatory, primitive or shamanistic cults of the Middle East, or else upon the adventures of certain spurious or self-deceived teachers who have regularly invaded the West since Victorian times. Let us now look at some of them. The most numerous emanate from the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent. Few are well educated, though many have what seem to be impressive degrees from local universities. They tend to favor outlandish garb, beards, and even turbans. They make trips across the world, contacting as far as possible both local Indians and Pakistanis, and also certain Western people who have heard about Sufism, trying to present themselves as legitimate teachers. They tend to be ignorant, and they usually try to get local people to form study groups and to raise money. Although they tell tall tales about their origins and their important spiritual teachers and ancestors, they are ignorant of the wider materials about the Sufis, and can always be detected if they are questioned from the basis of the classical Sufi books, of which they generally have only the slightest acquaintance. Real Sufi missionaries always speak the language of the country in which they are working perfectly. The accented tones of the adventurers generally give them away. The second group generally emanates from North Africa, notably Algeria and sometimes from Egypt. They are clearly to be recognized as sectarians as they stick to a limited number of excitatory techniques and rely heavily on the supposed sanctity of their saints, about whom they talk a great deal. Originally having made considerable inroads into certain French intellectual circles, they have now spread to several other countries. As with other secondary cults, they have succeeded in inducing some Orientalists to regard them as genuine expressions of Sufism, but this reflects such scholars' poor knowledge of the phenomenon. The third body of alleged Sufis are those who have become fascinated by the so-called dancing dervishes of Turkey. Some of them even emanate from Turkey itself, but these are, in general, in any case, followers of a mere cult, though claiming spiritual descent from the illustrious Jalaluddin Rumi, teacher of Konya. In fact, as is fairly well known, Rumi himself banned dancing except for certain specific cases. Furthermore, in all Sufi circles, dancing and all such movements are restricted to employees, since the effect of the movement and music is not on the participants, but upon the observers. That is why even the Mevlevi musical halls are technically termed Samakhana, hall of listening, and not hall of music or participation, or hall of taking part in dancing. Sufis are notoriously careful in their use of words, and this point is well attested through reference to the classical masters. What has perpetuated the thirst for participation in music and dance is nothing less than the aspiration which is specifically interdicted by the real Sufis, the desire for emotional stimulation. The dancers cover a great range, from self-deluded followers and self-imagined descendants of Rumi's way, to self-appointed teachers who have merely attended the deteriorated ceremonials of the cult. They delight, too, in dressing up in tall hats and flowing robes. Iran, in recent years, has given rise to a number of equally spurious sects, all using the name of Sufi. None of these is regarded as legitimate by the real Sufis of the East, though the numbers are increasing so rapidly, with followers in the West as well, that they may before long become accepted by Western people as genuine. There are also several stray Arabs who may or may not be sincere, who are carrying on supposedly Sufic activities in the West and in the East. They brandish what seem to be impressive credentials, and yet most of them are extremely ignorant about the real bases and procedures of the Sufis. They will tend to amalgamate bits and pieces of Sufi activity from any source, especially from books. Authentic Sufis go to great lengths to avoid actually meeting such people, partly to prevent them pretending that they have their blessing. The work and writings of Idries Shah in recent years have served to highlight many of the spurious practitioners, since Shah's published materials provide a basis from which to assess at least some of the adventurers. The Western Seeker seen through Eastern eyes. Alarida Ghulam Sawar. Most of the material on Sufi and other spiritual approaches available today is either in the form of accounts of ancient encounters between Sufis and others, or else Western appraisals of Sufis and supposed Sufis in the East and working in the West. It is hardly possible to find any account of how the Sufis of the East see the seeker of the West, his strengths and weaknesses, and his peculiar manner of approach. Peculiar here, of course, is used in the technical sense of special or characteristic, because the people of the West in general, sharing for the most part a common culture, will tend to approach and to view something outside of their format, as well as within it, in a manner conditioned by their own environment. Contemporary Sufis in the East have a remarkably homogeneous attitude towards the seeker from the West. Extensive enquiries have succeeded in eliciting the following personality picture from such teachers. The typical Western seeker is very much conditioned to names, symbols, and labels. He will be impressed if something which he has thought or felt seems to chime with something which he comes across in the East or in Eastern writings. Such is the influence of associations upon him. This associative tendency marks him out from the Easterner, who will want to know why something strikes him so powerfully, not merely be influenced by it. The Western seeker again holds in his mind a wide range of assumptions and imaginings about what is spiritual and what is not. Just as his ancestors, when they were pagans, were scandalized because the early Christians would not give divine honors to the Roman emperors, so his descendant is amazed when Sufis will acknowledge that certain things, regarded as sacramental or spiritual, are inherently important in spiritual activity. One of the reasons why a lot of Eastern mumbo-jumbo which is filtered into the West is so highly esteemed there, according to today's Sufis, is through this tendency to idealize and to idolize things which in the East are considered instruments or approximations. These two characteristics in the people of the West are joined by a third, though some Eastern Sufis claim that this is the most prevalent and least promising characteristic. This is the habit of people from the West to both embark upon a spiritual search without any careful preparation and self-examination, and also their determination to retain whatever principles, practices, and opinions they have acquired through their entire search. They do not, in sum, approach a teaching as a coherent whole with something to give, but rather in fact as something which should be at least partially amalgamated with their pre-existent beliefs. They are more than once termed collectors of trifles by Sufi divines, who are sometimes perplexed by this demand for teachings which not only accord with a preset pattern, but which also embody random parts of other teachings which happen to have caught the fancy of the seeker. Sufi diagnosticians aver that this tendency is linked with the general Western desire to retain control, or at the least choice, over what he or she does or believes. They further point out, however, that this is a misconceived attempt to protect or to shine, since all the evidence shows that Western people are heavily and frequently indoctrinated by their own systems, and also by any number of Eastern ones as well. The answer, as one Sufi puts it, is to show these people that in seeking to prevail or to maintain their own ideas, they do not protect themselves. When they come to see this, they can come to see that it is we alone who are fighting the battle against indoctrination in spiritual matters. Even their own systems do not do that. In fact, they make no bones about conditioning people very heavily. The results of this treatment they often term highly spiritual or really dedicated, failing altogether to note that the product is a result of brain engineering, not of faith. This contention, if true, surely deserves close attention and remedy. One surprise came when Sufi teachers in the East were asked about the difference between those Western seekers who wanted to submit to a master and those who adopted a cynical stance. Surely, they were asked, these represent two totally different types. No, indeed, came the answer. Both types are the same. The common denominator and determinant is that both are obsessed by certainty. The first type seeks certainty, the second seeks to retain it. What, then, ran the further question, should the attitude of the learner be? Making preconditions, like the desire for or dislike of certitude, is not a posture which will lead to learning. Only those can learn who will learn what is there, not those who want to learn through a method which they bring as their commanding principle. Of course, since the questioner himself comes from a Western thought pattern background, it was somewhat sobering to note how he had been unable to distinguish the identity of the two postures until this was pointed out. This kind of difficulty may well lie at the very heart of the Western-inspired disciplines through which we try to understand other cultures. The present writer put this question to a major Sufi theoretician in the Middle East in an attempt to elicit an opinion or guidance on this point. Would you say that our Western disciplines are so culture-bound that they cannot be used to approach non-Western systems such as that of the Sufis? The answer was unexpected. The Sufi systems are non-Western only in the sense that they are not very well developed in the West. There is nothing inherently Eastern about the Sufi methods, any more than there is really anything inherently Western about technology, just because it was developed in the West, having existed in the East previously, as the history of science shows. If you wish to adopt Western methods, you may do so providing that you do not limit yourselves to too narrow approaches. The most conspicuous is thinking that something which is spiritual must fit your own categories. Since the imposition of habit patterns is so fiercely disliked by the Sufis, it was necessary to ask their authorities how they could hope to decondition, or indeed to have a human being who had not been conditioned. The answer, again, indicated how superficially one had read the Sufi classics themselves, for it was contained in the work of, for instance, Rumi and Ghazali, 7 centuries to almost a millennium ago. What is today called conditioning is what used to be called habit patterns based on lower objectives. The Sufi method has never been to disturb those patterns, but rather to supply or make possible the development of a superior consciousness, which would be able to perceive the habit and regulate its value. Once a person can really experience the value or otherwise, the relevance or otherwise, of a conditioned form of behavior or thought, he or she will inevitably modify it. This is what we call polishing the mirror in one of its aspects. If you have a scowl on your face, and this scowl has become a habit, and you do not know about it, or do know and do not know how to remove it, you will be in a different state when you can see it in a mirror. Instantaneously or bit by bit, the reflection will do its job, coupled with the other things which you see in the mirror, for within it is the vision of what you could be like, sensed in an interior fashion, not, as with your Western people, by imitating other people. Once again, then, the investigator finds that the Sufi regards the would-be illuminate as someone who not only needs enlightenment, but as someone from whom a great deal in the way of misconceptions has to be eliminated. This is also said to be part of the progression by which veils are banished. The veils, in the way of the Sufi realization, then, may often be nothing more or less than habits which cannot be tackled, as we so often try in the West, by replacing them with other habits. The last remark of one Sufi master on this subject seems to shed further light on the problem. The person from the West has laudable and reprehensible attitudes of aspiration. The laudable is when he or she tries to set out on the path at all. The reprehensible is when he or she imagines that the seeker can make the rules. It is not without interest that, of all the Sufis and imitators visited and queried on this subject, it was the imitators who were unable to describe the shortcomings of the Western seekers in these terms, since obviously they welcomed the tendency towards obsessionality, which was often shown by their own Western disciples. They gave themselves away somewhat, however, by welcoming the obsessed Westerners as people who had seen the truth, and condemning the cynics as people not ready for enlightenment. Similar distinctions are made by false or primitive religionists throughout history and in all parts of the world.
This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.